Church History in Plain Language, 5th edition, by Bruce L. Shelley. Chapter 21, The Nectar of Learning. Scholasticism. For 8 centuries, Gothic cathedrals throughout Europe have inspired worshippers and awed tourists. The medieval masters of Gothic style tried to portray in stone and glass the central religious quest. They wanted to depict a tension. On the one hand were people aspiring to reach the heights of heaven, and on the other hand was God condescending to address the least of them. The movement of the Gothic, therefore, is two-way. The pillars, arches, and steeples, aligned like rows of rockets ready to ascend to heaven, point skyward. But through colorful windows of leaded glass, the light of God descends to meet the lowly. It is an architect's vision of human reason and divine revelation. Windows in the Gothic structure could be plentiful and large because the outside pillars and buttresses illuminated the need for thick walls. Between the shafts of slender stone, architects could set windows of colored glass. Artists used brilliant colors, crimson, blue, purple, ruby, to tell the story of redemption from creation to the Last Judgment. Worshippers, then, could ponder the sacrifice of Isaac, the crossing of the Red Sea, the birth of Jesus, or St. Anthony's struggle with devils. The effect was breathtaking. As the evening sun cast its warm, enchanting rays on the cold gray stone, even the cobbler from his pew could sense his kinship with Moses, Isaiah, Jesus, Paul, Augustine, and Benedict. Light, which played on the multicolored windows, had been a constant symbol of God and his ways with people. God is right, wrote the apostle, in him there is no darkness at all. 1 John 1:5. And Jesus himself used this image of his own incarnation when he announced, "I am the light of the world." The Gothic cathedral, therefore, displayed the spiritual tension of the Christian drama, the highest aspirations of humanity, and the descending light of God. People, in effect, ascend while God descends. Such language is, of course, figurative. God is no more above than below in any spatial sense, but Christians have always described their need in terms of reach, and God's truth in terms of descent. The rise of universities. Appropriately, schools in these cathedrals gave birth to medieval universities. For the supreme task of the university was to understand and explain the light of God's revealed and universal truth. Just as the Crusades reflected a widespread passion to extend the authority of God in Muslim lands, so the universities revealed an intense hunger to understand the truth of God received from any land. But just how did the world of ideas bow to the rule of God? How was reason made the servant of faith? We call this period in the history of Christian thought Scholasticism. Because a distinctive method of scholarship arose, and because a unique theology of the Middle Ages emerged. The aim of the schoolmen, as these teachers are sometimes called, was twofold: to reconcile Christian doctrine and human reason, and to arrange the teachings of the Church in an orderly system. A free search for the truth was never in view. Since the chief doctrines of the Christian faith were regarded as fixed, the purpose of discussion was to show the reasonableness of the doctrines and to explain their implications. The whole endeavor surged forward on the winds of intellectual curiosity. One 11th century scholar from Liege represents hosts of others. Quote, Olbert was not able to satiate his thirst for study. When he would hear of someone distinguished in the arts, he flew there at once, and the more he thirsted, the more he absorbed something delightful from each master. Afterward, just like the bees among flowers, gorged with the nectar of learning, he returned to the hive and lived there studiously, in a religious way, and religiously in a studious manner. End quote. Living religiously in a studious manner was the hallmark of medieval education. Its central aim was eternal salvation. Originally, however, learning had been limited primarily to the clergy. Benedict of Nursia had insisted that his monks read and study for their own spiritual development. As a result, Benedictine abbeys created a kind of rudimentary schooling in Latin. Later, in the 8th century, Charlemagne, dreaming of a Christian empire, had widened the opportunities of study through a decree that every monastery have a school to teach all those who with God's help are able to learn. The emperor himself set an example with a palace school for his own children and those of his courtiers. The best chance for learning among lay people came from cathedral schools. Since cathedrals, churches of the bishops, were located in towns, their schools to train parish priests were in time open to all. The curriculum of the cathedral school was limited to grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The seven liberal arts, so called because in ancient Rome their study had been reserved for liberi, freemen. The few texts available were writings of a handful of scholars of the early Middle Ages. One was Cassiodorus, a 6th century Roman, whose Handbook of Sacred and Secular Learning defined the liberal arts and interpreted the Bible. Another was Boethius, a contemporary of Cassiodorus, whose Consolation of Philosophy, written while he was in prison for an alleged plot against the barbarian king Theodoric, attempted to reconcile the misfortunes of humanity with the concepts of a benevolent, omnipotent God. These men, along with Augustine, Pope Gregory the Great, and a few other church fathers, were known as auctors, authorities, whose words the medieval student would not lightly presume to contradict. The magnetism of an able teacher. A new day dawned. However, with the coming of the great schoolmasters, we can trace the birth of universities to the magnetism of popular teachers, whose skill and enthusiasm for learning attracted students wherever they happened to be. As Annie Fremantle describes them, the first of this new breed was 10th century. The son of a serf, Gerbert was destined to end his days as Pope Sylvester II, lived from 999, was Pope from 999 to 1003. But he left a deeper mark on history through his scholarship. As a young monk, Gerbert had been so brilliant a student that his abbot had taken the unusual step of sending him to Spain to study mathematics. Although Gerbert's mentor there was a Christian bishop, he was also exposed to the broad and tolerant culture of the ruling Muslims. This was the first of a number of significant contributions Muslims made to the Christian intellectual awakening. Gerbert returned to Reims, deeply impressed by the inquisitive, questioning spirit of Muslim scholarship. When he began to teach at Reims, he announced that quotations of traditional church authorities no longer sufficed. His pupils were henceforth to study Roman classics in the original. To this end, Gerbert collected manuscripts wherever he could and built a sizable library. No mean feat at a time when a manuscript sometimes took a year to copy and cost at least the equivalent of a churchman's yearly income. The liveliest figure in this early stage of intellectual revolution was Peter Abelard, 1079 to 1142, the eldest son of a minor noble of Brittany, northwestern France. Abelard, for love of learning, had given up his inheritance rights to younger brothers and roamed France to sit at the feet of the great masters, now listening, now openly challenging them in class. In time he established himself as a lecturer in Paris, where he attracted a host of students. He also began to write. In a treatise titled Second None, Yes or No, Yes and No, he posed 158 questions from Christians' teaching and answered them with conflicting quotations from the scriptures, the church fathers, and pagan classics. The first key to wisdom, Abelard asserted, is assiduous and frequent questioning. For by doubting we come to inquiry, and by inquiry we arrive at the truth. This idea, commonplace to the Greeks, was hardly so to medieval Europeans. Abelard's zest for doubt won the applause of some, but alarmed as many others. Another of his books, on the nature of the Trinity, invoked condemnation by a church council at Soissons in 1121, and the brilliant scholar found himself behind the walls of a monastery. Resourceful as usual, Abelard secured the monastery's permission to leave a year later to live in the wilderness southeast of Paris. Students flocked to his side. They built him a shelter, tilled his land, and begged him to teach once more. Resuming his pursuit of reason, Abelard again and again fell afoul of conservatives in the church, this time including Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman in Christendom. Bernard persuaded Abelard as devoutly as he preached the Second Crusade. The faith of the righteous believes, he declared, it does not dispute. At Bernard's instigation, the church council at Sens in 1140 condemned Abelard for heresy. Abelard retired to the Abbey of Cluny, where he stayed in seclusion for the remaining 2 years of his life. No one, however, could stifle the growth of the seeds he had scattered. Schools sprouted all around the continent. Fewer than 100 years after his death, universities flourished at Paris, Orleans, and Montpellier in France, across the English Channel at Oxford and Cambridge, and at Bologna and Padua in Italy. The event that marked the flowering of the universities was the grouping of students and masters into guilds. As craftsmen had done before them, explains Fremantle, scholars banded together for mutual interest and protection, and called themselves a universitas, the medieval name for any corporate group. In Italy, where the majority of students were mature men pursuing advanced study in law and medicine, their guilds came to exercise great power. Students hired and paid teachers determined the courses to be given, and fined any lecturer who skipped a chapter in expounding his subject. At French and English universities, where students were younger, masters' guilds had the upper hand. They forbade students to swear or gamble, fined them for breaking curfews, and prescribed table manners. Cleanse not the teeth, one rule went, with the steel that is sharpened for those that eat with thee. Upon hearing university, we tend to envision ivied halls and grassy quadrangles. Medieval universities, however, not even the semblance of permanent quarters. At first, lectures were given in wayside sheds at Oxford and Cambridge, in the cathedral cloisters in Paris, and the squares in Italy. In time, teachers rented rooms, students sat on the floor, which was usually covered with straw against the dampness, unencumbered with athletic stadiums, libraries, or other equipment. Universities could pick up and move elsewhere at any time if they found themselves at odds with local citizens. In addition to lectures, the method of teaching was the disputation. Two or more masters and occasionally the students debated text readings, employing Abelard's question and answer approach, scholasticism, logic, conclusions. Scholasticism developed in this context and came to stand for painstaking arrival at logical conclusions through questioning, examining, and arranging details into a system of logic. The scholastic disputation stirred heated clashes and bitter feelings. Wars of logic ran for years between master and master, with the adherents of each cheering their hero on with tumultuous stomping and whistling. Something important was happening in this raucous atmosphere. Students were learning to think. Unquestioning acceptance of traditional authorities was no longer assured. Support for the papal monarchy. All this feverish activity proceeded, however, under the watchful eye of the papacy. Some debates continued for generations, but the popes worked to make sure that the result was a new philosophical framework that supported the papal monarchy. On the one hand was a new formulation of canon law, and on the other hand a systematic statement of Christian theology. The University of Bologna in Italy emerged in the later years of the 12th century as the center of the study of Roman civil law and church, or as it is called, canon law. Canon law served the church just as civil law supported a secular government. It defined the rights, duties, and powers of all people and priests within the church. It was the law administered in all ecclesiastical courts, from those of the bishops up to that of the pope. Sometime around 1140, Gratian, a monk of the monastery of St. Felix at Bologna, published a harmony of discordant canons, which tried to coordinate all previous collections of church law. Since he arranged his quotations of authorities subject by subject, his harmony soon emerged as the sole manual for teachers and for judges in the church. It served as the base for later additions to the body of canon law. Thus, by the 14th century, the Roman Church had at its disposal, until 1918, when it was revised, an authoritative body of laws to control and direct people's lives. Canon law interfered in wars and recognized the care of widows. It decreed fasting and feasting. It ordained confession and communion at least once a year. It specified that actions excommunicated a Christian from the church. But it also directed the most intimate of human relationships. By virtue of its concern with baptism, it established standards for all births, and all that led to births. The first inviting smile between a man and woman brought the couple under its watchful shadow. It directed penance for fornication and adultery. It laid down the conditions in which a marriage could exist. Canon law, in short, reached not only to every priest but to every layman, plowman, and prince, and it professed to declare not only the necessary path to salvation, but the very nature of the most intimate interactions between men and women. This craving to control, the zeal to reach every aspect of life, may have distinguished a fatal flaw in Christianity by law. It tried to reduce human freedom to a miserable minimum and forgot that God designed freedom as the forerunner for the coming of true faith. Canon law, however, gave to the papacy a rational legal basis. something the medieval state did not yet possess. As a result, the papacy rose to preeminent power in the public life of Europe and achieved an international prestige that far outweighed that of any feudal kingdom. On the day of Innocent III's consecration to the papal office, he took as the text of his sermon God's words in Jeremiah 1:10 KJV. I have this day set thee over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out, and to pull down, and to destroy, and to throw down, to build, and to plant. For 3 decades, that is what he did. He was the vicar of Christ on earth, thanks in large part to the universal authority conveyed in canon law. The second way the university surveyed the universal papacy was to provide an unshakable, rational theological construction of Christian society. By the 13th century, the writings of the ancient Greeks were pouring into Europe in greater volume, undermining faith and prompting heresies. Key works by Aristotle were now available, and his doctrines on the nature of the universe were leading students to doubt revelation. From Spain, the works of the Muslim philosopher Averroes and the Jewish philosopher Maimonides were spreading skepticism, most notably at the University of Paris. The peak of rational reach. The Church could not turn a deaf ear. To quiet the din, Thomas Aquinas, 1224 to 1274, was dispatched to Paris from Italy. Thomas was a Dominican monk of noble birth, brilliant mind, tireless industry, and gentle disposition. Like Abelard, he honored reason above all other human attributes, but he had distinguished himself by his fidelity to the Church, as well as his scholarship. Rather than denounce the tenets of Averroes, Maimonides, and Aristotle out of hand, he examined their writings point by point, refuting some and reconciling others with Christianity. The result was his Summa Theologica, a summation of theological knowledge. The Summa has in view the whole universe. Thomas says at the beginning, in sacred doctrine, theology, all things are treated from the standpoint of God, and the content of theology is in part God himself, in part other beings, and as far as they are ordained unto God. Aquinas made a clear distinction between philosophy and theology, reason and revelation, but there is no contradiction between the two. Both are fountains of knowledge. Both come from the same God. The two differ in their methods of searching after truth. Reason is based on the visible creation and can reach ideas that deal with the vestibule of faith. Revelation looks to God as he is in himself, and so is superior to reason, both in its certainty and in its subject matter. Reason, for example, can prove God's existence. Accepting Aristotle's principle, every effect has a cause, every cause a prior cause, and so on back to the first cause, Thomas declared that creation traces back to a divine first cause, the Creator. However, the full knowledge of God, the Trinity, for example, comes only through revelation. From this knowledge, we discover humanity's origin and destiny. Each person is a sinner and in need of special grace from God. Jesus Christ, by his sacrifice, has secured the reconciliation of humanity and God. All who receive the benefits of Christ's work are justified, but the key, as in traditional Catholic teaching, lies in the way the benefits of Christ's work are applied. Christ won grace. The Church imparts it. Aquinas taught that Christians need the constant infusion of cooperating grace, whereby the Christian virtues, above all love, are stimulated in the soul. Assisted by This cooperating grace, a Christian can do works that please God and gain special merit in God's sight. This saving grace, said Aquinas, comes to men and women exclusively through the channel of divinely appointed sacraments placed in the keeping of the Church, the visible, organized Roman body led by the Pope. So convinced was Aquinas of the divine sanction of the papacy that he insisted that submission to the Pope was necessary for salvation. Aquinas followed Peter Lombard in holding to 7 sacraments: baptism, confirmation, the Lord's Supper, penance, extreme unction, marriage, and ordination. The sacrament of all sacraments, however, is the Lord's Supper, which is more than the communion of the early Church. As the Roman Church had for centuries, Aquinas held that it is a true sacrifice, continuing that of Christ on the cross, and predisposing God to be gracious to those for whom it is offered. In the supper, the essence of the bread and wine are changed miraculously into the actual body and blood of Christ, while the exterior remains unchanged, a doctrine known as transubstantiation, of which Thomas gave the classic presentation. Since sin remains a problem for the baptized Christian, God provided penance, a sacrament of spiritual healing. According to Thomas, it consists of 3 elements: contrition, or sorrow for the sin; confession to the priest as a spiritual physician who can apply the appropriate remedy and pronounce absolution; and sanctification, by which the Christian makes good and evil effects of the sin, usually called an act of penance. With some cautions, Thomas also accepted the practice of indulgences that had gained prominence during the Crusades. Aquinas taught that thanks to the work of Christ and the meritorious deeds of the saints, the Church has access to a treasury of merit, a great spiritual reservoir. Priests may draw from this to aid Christians who have insufficient merit of their own. Death is the great divide. The wicked, said Thomas, pass into hell. The faithful, who have wisely used the means of grace, pass immediately to heaven. But the mass of humanity, who may have been Christian in desire and participants in the sacraments, has followed Christ inadequately and must suffer further purification in purgatory before attaining the joys of heaven. Thankfully, these souls are not beyond the help of the Church on earth. Prayers to the saints in heaven can prevail to relieve the pains of souls in purgatory. Thus we come to the peak of ecclesiastical aspiration and arrogance. Earth alone is not enough. The Pope and his priests not only mediate the grace of God to sinners on earth by the miracle of the blessed sacrifice and by their prayers for the dead, they reach beyond the grave to minister to suffering souls. There was nothing new in this. It had been said many times before, but Thomas set the traditional teachings of the Church in a grand, almost cosmic framework. Like the Gothic cathedral, his system aimed at a perfect harmony between the aspirations of human beings and the light of God's truth. It provided the papal monarchy an impressive supernatural view of this world and the next. But like the Crusades, scholastic theology may have reached too far, claimed too much for itself and the earth. A clue to the heights of arrogance lies in Innocence the Third's claim that the Pope is the judge of the world, set in the midst between God and man, below God and above man. The boast did not go unchallenged. A growing host of unlettered lay people remembered the apostolic testimony: there is one God and one mediator. Thus ends chapter 21. Thus ends chapter 21.